I don't have much time to build radio projects. That's a lament you often hear, and sadly there's only two solutions. Firstly, you can make time. That means spending less time at the pub, watching less TV, or maybe even using commuting time to be looking at radio books and planning projects. There's a lot of stuff on the web about time management, and I'm not going to lecture you here. The second approach is to be more efficient in your construction. That means building projects quicker, spending less time hunting for parts, and using construction methods that are more efficient. I'll give you a few tips on all those.
Think very carefully about the project you're about to attempt. An all-band SSB transceiver may seem good, but when you think about the time, the complexity, sourcing the parts, etc., it might not seem such a good idea. Instead, start with something more achievable. For instance, a transmitter or transceiver for one or two popular bands and modes. And for antennas, maybe a Moxon rectangle or 2-element Yagi for one band may be more buildable than, say, a 6-element multibander. You can always build the more advanced project later, once you've armed yourself with the confidence and expertise first.
Picture yourself using the project. If you don't think you'll use it, then maybe it's not worth building. But if you do think you'll use it, then it will give you more motivation to keep going.
Make sure the parts are easily obtainable before you start construction. There's nothing worse than having a project that's nearly built apart from one critical part that can no longer be obtained. That's why sticking with simple designs, especially those that use more discrete components than obscure ICs, is a wise move. A lot of time is wasted fishing for parts. If you don't have very many parts, they can be kept in a few boxes. But as you get more and more, then you separate the parts into smaller and smaller groups. For instance, instead of having one box for resistors, you may order them by value, with smaller and smaller groups of values as you get more components. There may even be times where it's more expedient to buy parts that you know are of the right value rather than fishing around in your box, even though you know you already have them. As for salvaging parts, you could spend time taking them out of the printed circuit board, but I find it's more robust if you leave them in and only pull them out when needed. Construction method is very important and can have a large bearing on the speed and success of your projects. Printed circuit boards are not really recommended. They make the project look professional, but at what cost? They take a long time to build. You've got to think about the layout, etch it, and then you've got to populate the board. Also, if you make changes to the projects, they can't readily be accommodated unless you make a whole new board. So, unless you want to make it a kit that other people can build, avoid printed circuit boards. Matrix board is quite a good choice, especially for projects with lots of ICs. Use the type of board with no tracks underneath. A strip board like Veriboard is unsuitable for RF projects because of the capacitance between the tracks. On the other hand, the type of perforated board with copper islands on each hole is, if anything, slightly easier, as it's easier to bend component leads to make them form tracks on the board, joining common connections. But my favourite form of construction would have to be simply soldering components onto blank printed circuit board. This is the copper side, which I've tinned, although that's optional. You can always use matrix board for components with narrowly spaced terminals such as ICs or even relays. This construction method is very fast and easy to troubleshoot. If you want to build a project efficiently, then there's no other way. I also like using printed circuit board material in which the copper has been cut into 5mm wide squares. A hacksaw is quite okay for that, though its blade does need to be fairly sharp. Again, this is best for discrete component designs. If you're planning construction on the weekend, make sure you have the parts sorted out beforehand. If you've got late night shopping on Friday and parts places are open, it's a good plan to spend Thursday night going through your list and seeing what you need. so then you can spend all the weekend building rather than buying. When ordering online, check delivery dates and make an allowance for any lateness to ensure that you get the parts in time. If you want the project to be built by others, try and specify the fewest values possible. That's especially for resistors, which often come in packets. It makes construction cheaper if you only need to buy a few rather than many. As an example, if a circuit has both 4.7 and 5.6k resistors, try and see if it will work with only one of those values. That also makes shopping lists shorter when you're ordering online. As an example, look at the BitX circuit presented here. That's an HF transceiver that, although it has many components, there's only a relatively small number of different values. For instance, resistors in 100 ohm, 220 ohm and 1k as well as 2.2k are very heavily used. And for capacitors, 0.1 microfarad is also commonly in the circuit. You may be able to get bulk discounts because of the larger number of components used of the one particular value. That in turn makes construction cheaper and it easier for people to put together kits if so desired. Build and test each stage at a time. That makes troubleshooting easier as faults could be more readily isolated. It's also another point in favour of using more open construction methods than printed circuit boards.
Hopefully I've given some tips that will make your next project quicker, easier and faster to build. If you've got any more, please share them in the comments box below.